Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Terrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. I want to say thank you so much for being here with us today. We have over 100 RSVPs for this conversation, and based on the conversations we've been having in community for the last couple of months, we know that this is very timely, and people are excited to dig into the issues we have in front of us today. This is our third continuing the conversation discussion we're leading on our report based on trust in policing, the role of white supremacy. Previously, we've met with community members, researchers, academics. Folks from Yale Law School have participated in these conversations, the NAACP, and today we're really excited and honored to have honest and open and real conversation with leaders in law enforcement from across the state. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to remind you that the Minnesota Justice Research Center is a 501c3 nonprofit focused on research, education, and policy development. Our mission is to transform our justice system to make it more humane, effective, and operate, most importantly, with the public's trust. Joining me today from the MNJRC team, we have Dr. Katie Remington Cunningham, who's our research director, who wrote the report on trust in policing, and Gina Evans, who is a member of the board. I just want to say thank you to both of you. Gina will be monitoring the chat and questions. So please, if you're joining us today, please feel free to utilize the chat feature or the Q&A section. And Dr. Cunningham will be presenting some slides on the report. The last thing I'll just say is that this this discussion will be recorded, is being recorded, and we'll be sharing it on our YouTube page and social media once we sort of make some minor edits on the front and back end to deal with dead space. So I'll do a quick overview of our discussion today. So in a moment, we'll do introductions. We'll have a presentation on the report, get reactions from our panelists, and then we will talk a little bit. We'll have some open dialogue before discussing some of the policies that are being debated at the Capitol around police reform for special session next week. Finally, I want to make sure people know that uh, actually, I think I covered it. Am I forgetting anything, Dr. Cunningham? All right. Yeah, so I think that's the flow of the conversation. I think we should jump into it to provide a little bit of context. So at the end of February, we released our first report of the year on trust and policing, the role of white supremacy. The report is fairly straightforward and just touches the surface. It's essentially a review of the evidence with some recommendations, but has already been proven to be an important tool for community members to engage in conversations around the issue. After releasing this report, we planned a series of conversations, online panel discussions. This is the era of Zoom. Hopefully, this is our last online Zoom discussion. We look forward to meeting with folks in person. Uh, and and really, I just want to say one final thing about this conversation. Here at the Minnesota Justice Research Center, we believe that there are shared values, more things that we have in common. And in our current climate, is important if we're going to find a way forward that we begin to identify those shared values, put data and research behind those ideas, and then develop policies that are affirmative to what community needs from law enforcement and for what law enforcement needs from community. If you showed up today for a debate on abolish or defund, this isn't that conversation. We at the Minnesota Justice Research Center, we aim to be a bridge, which means is the hard work. Sometimes you get stepped on when you're a bridge, but we are here definitely to try to build a dialogue and a pathway of connection across differences, so that we can wrestle with these big issues together and find a way forward. We believe in the humanity of everyone on this call, and we believe that the humanity and the struggles in the community need to be prioritized. And so that is what we aim to do in this conversation and the work that we do, to center the community, to center the folks who serve, and to find a way forward. So with that said, I will introduce our panelists, starting with Dr. Matt Bostrom from the Center for Values. Dr. Bostrom is a former Ramsey County Sheriff. Um, who currently has a PhD from Oxford and has done work in the community around aligning values between law enforcement and the community. Chief Blair Anderson is the chief of police for the St. Cloud Police Department. My experience with Chief Anderson has been really around community policing, so we invited him here to talk about some of the efforts going on in St. Cloud, including community outreach house that they have and operate, and the involvement of his officers in the community. Um, Next, I'll introduce Sheriff James Stewart, who's the Anoka County Sheriff. Sheriff Stewart also sits on the executive committee for the Sheriff's Association, which has testified on many police reform policies this year. And we're excited to have him share his perspective on those things. And then finally is Chief Kelly McCarthy from Mendota Heights. Chief McCarthy, also I refer to her as Chair McCarthy because she's the chair of the Minnesota Post Board, which is the state governing body over every licensed peace officer in the state of Minnesota. In full disclosure, I serve on that body as well. I'm not representing that body as I'm here today. This is my day job, so I won't be speaking to any of my agenda items for that body today. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Cunningham to provide a brief presentation on the report, and then we'll jump into our discussion. Once again, thank you to everyone for being here.
Great, thank you so much, Justin. So if you all will bear with me for a moment, I'm going to share my screen. It should be up and ready to go. Panelists, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you see my screen? Hopefully. Okay, great. All right. So I'm gonna jump right into, as Justin mentioned, and do a sort of a quick overview of the report that Justin has mentioned a few times. So I'm really excited to hear from this incredible panel of folks kind of about this report. And the goal of this presentation is really to just set the context for our discussion. So as Justin mentioned, the title of the report was Trust in Policing, the Role of White Supremacy. So at the Minnesota Justice Research Center, we explore the importance of values like trust in our criminal legal system. And research on trust in policing in particular paints a pretty clear picture. So what we see is that trust is low and has been declining, especially in communities of color. So this graph shows us, for example, that for the first time in 27 years, the majority of Americans do not trust the police. So you can see that 48% at the end there. And while this drop is significant, it's also important to note that over time, even when trust was at its height, more than about a third of the survey respondents did not have much trust in police. So this is not a new problem, but it seems to be one that may be getting worse. So we dug a little deeper into the data, and graphs like this one show us that the confidence varies depending on the race of the population surveyed. So since beginning these annual surveys, Gallup has found consistent differences between Black and white respondents. As of 2020, that difference was the largest it has ever been, with 56% of white adults reporting a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in police, compared to just 19% of Black adults surveyed. A little closer to home here in Minnesota, our partner is actually SEMA, who are helping us to sponsor this talk today, have found that we can see these differences play out in similar ways. So if we look at the red bars on the graph, about 30 plus 50 or about 80% of white Minnesotans, so higher than our national average, felt like they could trust the police, which is a pretty high number, while only about 20 plus 30 or about 50% of Black Minnesotans felt that way. So we're still seeing this gap. So when trust is low like this and these gaps exist, we wanted to dig into the research to learn a bit more. Many scholars have pointed out that the history of law enforcement in the United States is really inextricably influenced by racism and by centuries of white supremacy and Black oppression. But the reality is white supremacy culture is really baked into our society at every level, and none of us is immune. So this is certainly not just a problem with police, but so many systems in our country. And unfortunately, police are faced with an extremely hard job and the stakes are higher. So a really important question is If white supremacist ideologies are really in many ways in the air that we breathe and in some of the foundations of law enforcement, how might communities of color ever trust the police? So we think one important step is to really understand the role of race in policing in particular to address it. And we think this may start by recognizing continued prevalence and the danger of white supremacist ideologies. So for this report, we really focused on what we call the connection between those with explicit white supremacist ideologies and hate groups and law enforcement. So we really sort of dig into what the Anti-Defamation League calls sort of the full-fledged ideologies, more explicit and in some ways perhaps less insidious than the sort of broader systems and structures of white supremacy that really characterize the racism that plagues our nation, really. And we want to be pretty clear here. So there's a deeper and challenging issue at play with all of us and with the role of white supremacy as a system in policing. But for our report, we wanted to really start by examining a small part of this problem that the research actually shows us is really critical. So to reference a metaphor that's often used in conversations around policing, we really wanted to start by exploring sort of those bad apples, but also remembering that sometimes by the time an apple is rotten, it's spoiled the whole group. So we really want to dig into those explicit ideologies and see what we can find. So I want to go through a few contemporary examples of white supremacy in policing that we found in our research. So back in 1995, a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center explicitly warned police and government officials of the growing threat of violence from what they called extremists and militant white supremacists. About a decade later, in 2006, the FBI released an intelligence assessment called White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement, describing how the presence of white supremacists often among law enforcement is a really significant concern. Almost another decade passed, and another FBI report found links between police and white supremacist groups, along with what they called direct infiltration of police departments. And over the past decade, in 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2020, just to name a few, many scholars and journalists have begun to examine this issue. And these reports really highlight infiltration intelligence, some research and online data combing, examination of direct evidence in some cases, and exploring a lot of local incidents that are spread across the US. Then finally, on January 6th, the insurrection on our nation's capital really shined an even brighter light on the problem. The expressions of white supremacist ideologies and affiliations are becoming more emboldened and progressively more explicit and overt. However, there's effectively, perhaps not surprisingly, no publicly available data on the prevalence of white supremacists in law enforcement. So instead, most of what we know really arises from sort of journalistic explorations and scandal or discovery. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? We think the first and really most critical step that we must take is to talk about this issue, part of why we're here today and we've been having these conversations. So in particular, policymakers, public officials, law enforcement, those of us who care about this issue really must come together and talk honestly about the problem of white supremacy in policing. We believe if we can all show we're willing to call the problem by its name and try to stop its growth in the shadows for 20 more years, we'll take a really important first step towards increasing trust between law enforcement and communities. Additionally, we believe we need accessible data, both on white supremacy in law enforcement, but also on racial bias and how it functions in policing and other systems and structures more broadly. So as researchers, we really value and seek data to understand and to discuss an issue with as much clarity as possible. And so there are a plethora of examples that highlight the presence of the problem, but many people can point to examples that show that there is no problem. And so we really need to actually dig into the nature of this issue and to understand the issue alongside the messier and sort of critical root cause I mentioned before, the more pervasive and structural racism issues that exist all across our country. In addition to collecting more data on the nature of the relationship between race and police more broadly, we also believe that we must move forward with attempts to address this urgent issue. One place that we think that taking action may make sense is to prohibit the licensure of officers who have associations with white supremacist groups or who really express these ideologies. We think considering something like licensure is important because the data shows us that responsive accountability measures, so things like firing officers after the fact or litigation, really require significant resources and actually work to further erode the public's trust. And finally, As these policies take shape, we must also put evaluation plans into place to really determine if and how they work. So there are many instances, both in the criminal legal context, but also in social systems research more broadly, of interventions and solutions and ideas that are really well-meaning, but actually ineffective. And so we need to set out a plan for next steps, for longer-term change, for collaboration, and deep evaluation to determine if what we're trying to do to make change is actually achieving that change that we want to see. So trust in policing seems like a clear challenge, and there are certainly a lot of aspects to unpack and dig into. And if we believe that trust is important, trust both in our current system of law enforcement and in whatever any future systems of public safety really look like, we believe one place that we should start is by having conversations about the role of white supremacy. MNJRC is really committed to this work. Moving forward, we're eager to continue this conversation and engage in further research and action. So prior to this conversation, as Justin mentioned, we held a few other panels with community members, with researchers, with policymakers, and we definitely invite you to watch those conversations on our YouTube page. We'll share some links in the chat moving forward. We also invite you to read the full report. So I just spent about 8 minutes flying through a longer report where we really get into the data. And we definitely invite you to visit our website, mnjrc.org/research, and you can find the full report there. You can also connect with us. We want to hear from you. In addition to your questions and comments today, connect with us on social media or online and share your thoughts and perspectives. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to kick it back to Justin to continue this conversation and engage with our panelists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cunningham. I'm excited now to pivot to our panel and have you all respond. I have just a few questions to kick us off. We'll start with Dr. Bostrom, and just for folks, so folks know that we have the next hour and so we plan to go to 2 p.m. That was my last announcement that I forgot. So we plan to go to 2 p.m. And so this will definitely have plenty of time to dig into these topics. So we'll start with just a few questions based on folks' areas of focus. So Dr. Bostrom, as the president of the Center for Values and also a former sheriff, can you tell us a bit about your work on the role of trust in policing? And in addition, how has white supremacy impacted the profession of law enforcement?
So, all right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to join you, Justin. Thank you for that invitation. And so my history in this comes from a point that I don't think that we can point to a time in history where there was ongoing mutual trust between police and the community anywhere in the world. I don't think it's ever happened. To my knowledge, I've never read that it's happened. What I have seen is, in what was shared with us, is that there's an ebb and a flow. That there's certain times where it's worse than others. What I have noticed, though, that's common throughout time is that community members do want to trust the police. And I also know within policing that there are deputies and police officers that are desperate to be trusted by the community. My question then is, if we both want the same thing, there's got to be ways that we can bring those two things together. And so part of what I ended up working on really is just following up on some community engagement meetings that we had in St. Paul more than 20 years ago. And in those meetings, the community talked about concerns about racial profiling, bias in policing, maybe conscious or unconscious. But in any case, there was a lot of things about the St. Paul Police Department at the time that they liked, but they found that trust wasn't where they wanted it to be, and they thought it was declining. Then Chief Finney decided to go further into that and tried to sort it out and had difficulty. He did what most police officers do, and that is we go to public meetings with things that initiatives that the department is doing, data that shows crime statistics on where they were last year versus where they are this year, and present those in a way to have confidence in the police, hoping that if you have confidence, you'll have trust. Well, there wasn't necessarily that the safety issues weren't being addressed by the police, but there was something in the relationship that seemed to be declining, and trying to find out what that was. And so ultimately, the chief assigned a person to take a further look into that, and he went into some deep community engagement meetings. And in many ways, for those that are familiar with focus group research, ultimately that's what happened. It's really got in deep in these really intimate settings to ask people, what does it take to increase trust between the community and the St. Paul Police Department? And what came out of that was an axiom. And the axiom was, we want the police department to hire for character and train for competence. The community didn't believe that the police department would have the ability to take in people and then train the type of character that the community wanted into those people and be assured that it's there while simultaneously giving them the skills they need. They said it would be better to look for the right people and then train them so that when they came out, they had the character and values the community was looking for. Because if we exude those values, even unspoken, what we're communicating is stabilizing, trustworthy behaviors of respect, compassion, dedication, those types of things that if we don't even have to speak those things. When people see us doing that, they'll trust you. So anyway, the community was really onto something. So over time, I had a chance to go further with that because I'm a believer in community policing, that if we say we're going to do something on behalf of the community, we need to. And I had a chance to do some of that work and follow up on those principles, because the issues of character, well, some people would say, wait a minute, how do we talk about character? In this case, it's really not about how any of us on this call think about character. Mm-hmm. It's about what the community that the police officers are serving. What is the character there? That if the police officers exhibit those things, and where does character come from? It exudes out of our values. So you can talk about character, you talk about values, but ultimately, when the cops have the shared values of the community and they act in ways that are consistent with those, trust goes up. And interestingly enough, and not surprising for any of us, when you feel trusted, how do you behave? You improve the way that you're serving, because the last thing that we would want to do is lose someone's trust once we've gained it. And so with that in mind, the community made that recommendation. The second thing that they made, now remember, we're going back plus 20 years now. Mm-hmm. They said, if you hire men and women that have these values that we're talking about, it's not in their moral character to racially profile. It's not in their moral character to stand by if they see someone acting with bias. They would have a responsibility to step in. And so the idea that you have to do ongoing sensitivity training, they could be teaching the classes. They already have it. So the idea, and so the community is right. They were right then, and they're right today. Mm-hmm. And so the work that I've been involved in is to then take that information and do something that we haven't done in a while, and to go into a police department and ask them, hey, here's what your community had to say about character and values and what makes a trustworthy police officers. How do you react to this? Did they miss something? Did they say something that doesn't make sense? And every time I've had those conversations inside police departments, their response has been, there's a deep pause because it's not what they expected. They look at the list, they look at what the community said and how they talked about it, and what they emphasized. And they said, the community says it better than we could ever say it. That's exactly what we believe. And the men and women in the room, that's what they aspire to be. They aspire to be men and women with cultural competence, servant leadership, emotional intelligence, and people of high character. And so in their processes, that's what they're seeking to do. However, they've been unable to necessarily communicate that effectively back to the community. So here we have two things. One, the community saying, this is what we want, and police departments overwhelming saying, that's exactly what we're doing here. How come the community doesn't understand that? And I think that's where, how does that happen? It comes through relationships. So what I've been working on is trying to continue to operationalize ways that we can hear directly and intimately from the community, then attach that to what the police departments are doing, and thereby starting to say, we have a, shared meaning, shared values. That's what we're doing. And so that's the objective. And over time, just like a relationship, there's probably people listening to me right now that say, yeah, I kind of trust that guy. They don't know why. And then there's others that have their arms crossed and they're like, I don't know what to make of this guy. It just takes time for each person to build a level of trust, implicit trust. It takes time. And that's the other difficulty that law enforcement has, is that there's people that can go a lifetime and they're lucky if they ever are close enough to even wave to a police officer. And then there's others, because of circumstances in their life, are constantly being challenged in challenging situations that require lots of intervention and interaction with police officers. So, but then it's not even the same officers. Yeah. So think about all of our trust relationships, everybody on this call, the people that we go to, that we think are honest, the ones that when we're in trouble, we go to. Where did that happen? That wasn't a one and done. And that's a part of the whole trust in the police piece, is that there's a lot of threads to this. The exciting part is that we're not nearly as far apart as we think we are. The challenge, though, in the midst of all of our busyness and the challenge and the pressures that we have, is how do we get both sides to understand that, and to understand that they're moving forward and they actually care about the very same things.
Thank you, Dr. Bostrom. I think that's a great place to start. I think, especially highlighting the point that you made about community wanting a certain thing and law enforcement wanting the same thing, and then that breakdown, I feel like it's appropriate to go to Chief Anderson. So as the police chief in St. Cloud, you've been doing recent work around community policing. What does it take to build trust between the community and law enforcement? And how do you see the impact of white supremacist ideologies on your efforts to build stronger relationships with communities? I've spent a little bit of time in St. Cloud when I was at the state. I visited your office, Chief Anderson, and I know that your officers are very involved in the community. I also know that tensions around around white supremacy in St. Cloud are real. And so I'm excited to have you respond to this question.
Excellent. Thank you for having me too. I just want to preface my comments with a couple of quotes. I don't often do this, but when they move me, I feel compelled to share them. And one was from Stephen Covey. And these are some of the things that drive me. And one of the greatest quotes he made was that it's better to try and understand than to try and be understood, right? And so what that means to me, how that moved me, is that it means that you are coming to whatever situation you're in from a position of empathy. And one of the things that is not negotiable, I don't have a lot of rules as a chief. I have a few, but at the top of the list is that we do not strip human beings of their dignity, ever. Anybody who works with or for me knows that. And if they do, they have to come see me. And it's not going to be a pleasant visit. So to answer your question, how do you build trust and legitimacy and all that stuff? And I know that President Obama convened a panel with folks, and they came up with all these recommendations for 21st century policing. And so I'm just going to say this, I'm just going to keep it real. I didn't need a group of PhDs to tell me how to engage my community. Now, having said that, with the utmost respect for Dr. Bostrom, because he was one of my mentors, he instructed me in graduate school, and I love and respect him and everything he's done. And so here's where it starts. It starts with whom you hire, and he's already touched on this, right? The character-based hiring process is something that he has researched, and it was so funny when he finished his dissertation. It was something that I was doing, but I called it something else. And I've had the pleasure to present that with Dr. Bostrom and Dr. Hodges at the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And so here's how we do it. And I can't speak for any other agency except for the one that I am in charge of right now. Here's how we do it. It's very deliberate. And I call it making a deposit into the reservoir of trust every day. And so it's more than just coffee with a cop every quarter. It's more than just handing out bike helmets or Dairy Queen coupons to kids because they're riding their bikes with a helmet on. It is a very deliberate effort. And to that end, I stood up an entire division dedicated to community engagement. And so here's the good news, because in St. Cloud, we get a bad rap. They earned the reputation that they had as White Cloud back in the 80s and all that stuff. But it is not the same anymore. It's different. And so the only reason I'm saying that is because I'm an ambassador for St. Cloud, because obviously I work there and I'm representing that community, and I want the whole world to know what a fine community it is. And so here's an example of how that works. We stood up our community outpost. It is not a police substation. It is exactly what the name says it is. It is a community outpost. It is a literal oasis in the desert. And when we were standing this thing up, we put it, everything was deliberate about it. And so we put it in an area where clearly we had the most calls for service and the most trouble. It's in one of our more indigent neighborhoods in the city, and it is heavily populated by our East African demographic, for lack of a better word. And so there was fear, right? There was fear about what this was going to be. And it got to the point where there were a whole lot of folks in that neighborhood who thought that it was, and this is true, they thought it was an FBI spy house on them because they were immigrants, because they had just immigrated here from East Africa, from Somalia. And so how we overcame that, we literally went door to door. And when I say door to door, I mean every door in that neighborhood we knocked on, and we talked to those people and explained to them what it was we were trying to do. And what we didn't do was tell them what we were going to do. We asked what was needed in that neighborhood. And so that is what drives our programming. That is what drives, that is the thrust behind the whole operation of our community outpost. And so if you ask me, well, how do you build trust and legitimacy? I say that you do that every minute, every hour of every day. It is not something that you do once a quarter or biannually. It is done by engaging and asking the people that you are serving what it is that they need. And in order to do that, you have to see them. And of course, you have to listen to them. And I'm very proud of, you know, we get a very bad rap about what St. Cloud is or what it isn't. And whenever I hear people talk about what it isn't, I know that they haven't been there for a while, because clearly the demographics has changed. The city has grown, the region has grown. Most people don't understand this, that when school is in St. Cloud State and the technical college are in, right, from September to May, St. Cloud is the largest city between Fargo and Minneapolis, if you think about it, population-wise. And then our service population is triple what our residential population is. So our residential population is about 69 or 70,000, but on every single day, there are 180 to 200,000 people in St. Cloud because it's a regional hub, right? And so our vision and our views are not myopic. And so we've taken all those things into consideration. And I can't overemphasize this enough. We ask, we don't tell. That's how you build trust and legitimacy. And then when we ask and people tell us what they need, we circle back and we follow up with those same needs. We don't ask them for lip service. We don't ask them just for window dressing. We ask them because we are legitimately and earnestly concerned about what their needs are. Mm-hmm. To the second part of your question, where you ask, well, what is white supremacy? What role does that play in this? Here's my answer to this. And some people are not going to like it, but it's going to be my answer anyway. We take our personnel from the human race like everybody else. And in my 26 years in law enforcement and my more than 50 years on this planet, the only thing that changes hearts and minds are events. And so what we are doing is trying to mitigate, because I don't know how to unlearn somebody what they have been taught and what has been instilled in them from the time they can remember. And so the best way for us to mitigate that is to take people where we find them, and how they approach us is how we receive them. And I know this all sounds cliche and it sounds corny, but I'm telling you, this stuff works. I take people how they come to me. I've been a victim of a hate crime. I had my house firebombed, and it wasn't in Georgia in 1964. It was in South St. Paul, Minnesota in 1994, because I had the temerity to marry a white woman and have mixed race babies, my little twist cones. That's what I call them. So you guys can laugh or think I'm insensitive, but that's what they are to me. I love them to death. But having said all that, I feel that I'm qualified to say it this way. Boy, racism exists everywhere in our society, in every corner. And so I think the larger question should be, what are we doing to address that across the board, as opposed to laser beaming in on police? I know that this discussion is about police and trust in communities of color, but I'm from a community of color. I grew up in the hood in Detroit, and my experience with the police was always positive, but that's just mine. I can't speak for anybody else's. And so what has driven and what I think works, and well, what I know works, I'm not going to even say I think it works, is taking people how they come to you, seeing them, listening to them, blocking out the noise, and then following through. If you say you're going to do something, to Dr. Bostrom's point, then you go ahead and you do that based on the feedback that you've gotten from your community. And I can tell you, and in fact, you don't have to believe me. Ask the citizens of St. Cloud what they think of their police department and how they feel they are policed. Is everybody going to always be happy? Absolutely not. We all know that. But I can tell you this, and I'll be quiet after this. The day or two after the 3rd precinct was burned to the ground last summer, I pulled up to the police department, and there were 2 of our fine citizens in St. Cloud planting flowers. Do I need to say anything else? That tells me all I need to know about what our community engagement efforts are, you know, what fruit we're bearing from that, how effective they are. And the reach is long. We start with the youth, because we don't want them to be clients of ours later. We engage them now because we want them to see us before they are in crisis.
Yeah.
So I'll be quiet if that answers your question. If not, please ask a follow-up.
I definitely think that we have some digging to do on this topic, but I deeply appreciate especially talking about having your house firebombed. I mean, we know we have an issue with white supremacy in our country, and within the systems that govern our communities. And so it's important that we share those stories and that we create spaces to connect to them.
What I didn't mention, Mr. Terrell, I'm sorry to interrupt you, is it wasn't firebombed by the police, right?
I gathered that, yeah.
Citizens, so
I want to move to Sheriff Stewart. Thank you, Chief Anderson. Sheriff Stewart, as a member of the executive committee of the Sheriff's Association, your group has been at the table considering reforms such as the bill that Dr. Cunningham referenced that would prohibit licensed officers from associating with organizations the FBI has identified as white supremacist terrorist groups. Can you share your perspective on the problem? How does a bill like this create an opportunity for law enforcement to stand against white supremacist groups that have been far more active in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Justin, and the whole team for having us together, for bringing this group together. It's certainly an important dialogue for us to be having. I am privileged as an executive committee member for the Minnesota Sheriff's Association, but also for the National Sheriff's Association. And I've been fortunate to work with the good-hearted protectors from all around our nation. The word ambassadors came up earlier. Everyone on my team routinely hears me use that word. I can hire somebody to write damage to mailbox report or write accident reports, but it's way more important for every one of our members to embrace being an ambassador who pursues positive impacts in our communities. And that's the message we've continued to relay as a matter of who we are in our core culture. But across our nation, the protectors that I've worked with, that I've met, they represent every walk, every neighborhood, and they represent everyone. And I've also been privileged to be a part of discussing the police reform efforts over the past few years. And I continue to see and be proud that the law enforcement leaders are committed to building those bridges. You talked about bridges earlier, and I love that example because for us, maintaining the public trust is a part of our mission statement. And a big part of that is building those bridges. But we know in order for any bridge to be effective, as you mentioned, it gets walked on. But in order for a bridge to be effective, it also needs strong and equal support from both sides. And so that's where I see a lot of these dialogues going, and we really need to continue these partnerships and these dialogues. As the police reform bills are typically presented to us, sometimes by legislators or lawmakers, I think what I have seen is more often than not, most of the lawmakers have been shocked to learn that we support most of the efforts. In fact, much of the law enforcement community have had a lot of those recommendations in place for many years, and in some places even for decades. And so that's, I think, a common misconception is how broken is a law enforcement community? Because as we talked with lawmakers about some of these reforms, I said, we've literally had those in place. I started with this office Valentine's Day 1994, and I said on day one, when we were going through our initial hire use of force training, I was told to stay away from the face or neck unless it was deadly force. That's what's been in place. And so the question then became, well, why do other agencies not have that in place? And I said, that's a great question for some of those agencies. But I think that you'll find the vast majority of Minnesota's law enforcement embrace doing the right thing, embrace that accountability and those model policies. While some of the reform ideas, like specifically the qualified immunity aspect, are nice maybe in theory, and implementation, quite honestly, would be disastrous to communities and the profession as a whole, leaving dangerous safety issues and gaps in place that simply could not be mitigated. Now, having said that, and I say that broadly speaking, I know that my colleagues on the line, and I know the majority of law enforcement communities say we support accountability. And in fact, we fought successfully for the better arbitration process that is in place now for that very reason. We wanted enhanced accountability and the ability to be able to effectively discipline officers who aren't carrying the line and represent each one of us. And so we also support model policies because, simply put, they make our jobs better defined and thus easier for those that are doing it. I'm trying to think of the other part of the question. So racism, I mean, we know it exists. We know that. We need to address it. We need to have frank and open and honest and candid dialogues and to continue building those bridges. But as far as the white supremacist groups are concerned, the mere concept, in my opinion, runs counter to who law enforcement officers are. And after 3 decades in law enforcement, I can say that I have not seen directly or experienced anything that supports some of the reports that have been referenced. I've not observed a law enforcement connection or affiliations with supremacist organizations, and simply nor would we tolerate it. I'm not blind, I'm not ignorant, and I'm not hiding anything. I'm just being honest. And I think, as we look at it, deciding to serve others as a law enforcement officer runs counter to any type of hate, and especially a hate group, as we strive to protect and to serve everyone in our communities to the degree that we're willing to run into a firefight in order to ensure the safety of those citizens that are caught up in that area that we want to be able to help them. It would also be incredibly difficult for a supremacist to infiltrate Minnesota law enforcement. I can't speak to other states as broadly because I know a lot of states have different criteria, but in Minnesota law enforcement, it would be very difficult because even if they decided to try, we do highly involved psychological evaluations. We do exhaustive background investigations, and we screen for any bias or negative issues like that. And we also have a training and screening process in which we monitor those interactions and wash out any candidates that might display any lack of integrity. Integrity is paramount, and I know I don't stand alone when I say that is the standard and we will not deviate. In short, we strive as Dr. Bostrom and I have spoken many times. We strive to have great humans on our team. We can teach you the functions of the job, but I want good people with strong moral compass and values on our team, because that's who we want serving our community. So in short, we, with our communities, embrace the accountability. We stand in total opposition to any type of hate groups, because hate is hate, and we simply won't tolerate it within our ranks. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff Stewart. I'm excited to close this section of the conversation with Chair McCarthy, and I think just based on what's been said, I'm really looking forward to the sort of the open dialogue section of this talk, and so of this panel. Chair McCarthy, Chief McCarthy, considering your work on the Minnesota Post Board and as the Chief of Police in Mendota Heights, how do you think about the role of the Post Board when we talk about white supremacy as a system baked into the profession of policing and beyond just individual actions?
Great questions, and thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. There's no more important topic in law enforcement. What Dr. Bostrom said was, absolutely true, that trust and relationships, they're local. The Post Board is addressing the profession statewide. And so for me personally, I don't really look at it regarding trust. I look at it more, it's a fee for service. We get paid to provide a service. And so we need to make sure that police officers in Minnesota have what they need. We have a baseline skill set for every officer in Minnesota to put them in the best position to provide those services in the way that their community expects. And that can be different from community to community, but there still needs to be a basic bottom line regarding services. And so we want to make sure that we're providing agencies and citizens with the resources they need to make sure that they're getting the police protection that they want and deserve.
Thank you. Direct to the point, Chair McCarthy.
You already know that about me.
This is true. So I think I'm going to rearrange. So there's a lot that's been said that we can unpack. And so I think what I'd like to do is just do a quick check. Does anyone have a reaction to anything that someone said that they would like to comment on from the panelists, just in reaction to each other? And then I'm going to ask Katie and Gina to ask a few questions from the chat. And then I have some thoughts that I would like to share as well. Go for it, Chair McCarthy.
Just real quick, I am so jealous of people who have been in this profession and haven't had to experience white supremacy or haven't seen it. Because I have. And I have, where I live, and I won't name the department, their employees driving vehicles with 3%er stickers on them. That's white supremacy. When we had a union official in a neighboring city that was part of a motorcycle gang that allowed Nazi insignia, that's white supremacy in this profession. We recently on Facebook had a group, it was called Land of 10,000 Cops, and I would be very surprised if other people were unaware of it. That was essentially a hate site. It was a group of police officers on Facebook, and the negativity exchanged in that site, and they eventually shut it down because they were hacked, meaning somebody took screenshots. So I think if you look for it, it's around us, and our communities certainly see it. And so I think it's difficult to hear me as the Pollyanna police chief, because I do have such a positive view of police. There's people wondering, well, if you guys are so great and there's no white supremacy in law enforcement, why do we have these bad outcomes? So, I think we have to cut to it and really figure out how we're going to get better. And these conversations, I think, are a very, very small, very first step.
Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Matt, do you have any reactions to that?
Well, I think the way I would respond to it, there's a few things that are running through my mind. I'm just tracing my life back to, I'm the old guy. And thinking about times, even in a police locker room. Well, I mean, women were very mildly represented in law enforcement at that time. As we know, over time, having increasing diversity in departments continues to be a challenge. I would like to talk about that before we conclude at some point, if that works. But there's been I've never heard, even in a locker room. Now, you'd think they'd let their guard down with another old white guy. All right, so all my time in St. Paul, from the time as a patrolman to sergeant to assistant chief, and then moving over into the sheriff's office, there you have another 400 plus. I mean, we're talking thousands of people, majority white. And then outside of that, other interactions that I've had at major events and everything. I've never seen anybody say something. Now, have I heard people make inappropriate comments they thought were jokes that were not jokes, gender-based jokes? Have I heard those? Absolutely, I've heard those. Here's the good news, is that those have been on a steady decline to the point that people stop if they hear something like that. Now, at least in the agencies that I've been affiliated with. So, and then there's three things that would happen. St. Paul Police Department under Chief Finney, under John Harrington, Tom Smith, Todd Axtell, under me as sheriff of Ramsey County. 3 people would get fired if there was somebody that got through the background process that had any affiliation with some sort of white national group. The candidates fired, the background investigators fired, and the sergeant's fired that oversees all of those things. There's 3 people gone on that type of an event. And there was somebody else that, was doing, for lack of a more technical term, doing some chin rubbing about this. And it was somebody even more senior than me. And he said, the reason, and this was, and I think the logic actually works and probably has a lot to do with what, what Chair McCarthy is part of, and also what Sheriff Stewart was talking about. And it's this, that in order to become a police officer in Minnesota, you have to finish high school, you have to go to college, you have to succeed at your skills level, you have to pass a test, you have to then pass a series of tests and hurdles that were just mildly touched on. That's before you even get the interview at a department and go through the background process. Based on my knowledge and experience investigating white supremacy, there aren't people in that movement that have that kind of patience or commitment, because they're going to be then one of 600, one of 500, one of 400. And then they're going to have to uphold policies, state laws with which they don't agree with them. And so they're going to be up for discipline, which brings back to the work of the post board, legislature, and the accountability features help backstop some of that, so that if there is somebody that somehow does slide through, there is a place then that, okay, we had all those measures in place, we still missed somebody. So here's what I would say is, our work on these types of this topic or any other topic, if we assume we're ever done, we will have a blind spot that is going to create a major problem. And so I'd love to say, hey, I can just chime in and say, yep, it's prevalent, I've seen it. And in all honesty, I wouldn't have passed the polygraph test if I was asked that question. I just have to share my experience and also my knowledge of these particular groups and why they would not have a strong preference to participating in that. Now, here's another part, is I thought it was interesting what Chair McCarthy said.
So I'm going to wrap up your comment, Dr. Bostrom.
Yep. All right, let me just give you, I'm sorry about that. Sorry for going so long. I just want to add that I think we really do need to be mindful that what happens with folks that have been disgruntled or distrusted for a long time and feel misunderstood, do they start to look for other places for validation, and where do they get that validation? And I think some of the folks that Chair McCarthy mentioned was just that you have people that were bad hires, okay, and then they weren't getting validation in a way that would, so the point is they need to go, but we need to have mechanisms in ways that we can sort those people out. We need to have policies in place so that they could, that we don't have to retain those employees. So it's both ways. Who do you hire? And then what are you doing to reinforce those positive values inside your organization? And then if you miss somebody, what mechanisms do you have in place then to have them pursue their future someplace outside of law enforcement?
Absolutely. I have a lot of reactions to this conversation. I will just point out, and then we'll move to I'll have Katie and I'll have Dr. Cunningham and Gina grab a couple of questions, because the chat there's a lot happening over here, and I want to make sure we address that. I love when community shows up to ask the real the difficult questions. So the one thing I would just say in response to this conversation, earlier on, I think Chief Anderson, you said it's better to be understood. It's better to seek understanding than to seek to be understood. And, we live in a state with, how many licensed officers? We have like 11,000, I believe, something like that, and 200 Black officers. We have some of the worst racial disparities in the nation. We are an hour into this conversation, and the name George Floyd hasn't been mentioned, or Winston Smith, Jamar Clark, Terrence Franklin, the list goes, Q the blacksmith, the list goes on and on and on and on. And I just wonder and I do want to get to questions in the chat. So, forgive me for making more of a statement than a question, but in seeking understanding, what I tend to experience as a Black man in Minnesota is not that, right? There's often, and I think other groups, I think women, the transgender community, not to speak for people outside of my own identity, but often when you are not part of the majority or professions that yield a bit of authority and power, I don't know that you feel like people seek to understand you. Rather, there is a lot of explaining that comes from law enforcement specifically. What I would like to seek understanding, and what I think a lot of people in our state are trying to seek understanding around, is why. Why is Minnesota why are we the state that sparked outrage around the world? Why are we the state that has failed communities of color in every category? It's not just law enforcement, right? A few weeks ago, there was an article about dismantling child protection, which is a system that removes Black children from Black families at 3 times the rate of white families for the same type of complaints. And that's the data piece that really struck me when I was working on that issue. Are we seeking understanding around these issues? And if we find things that we don't like maybe the punitive nature of law enforcement needs to be addressed because there are other types of justice, are we willing to wrestle with that? Feel free to respond briefly so that we can get to the community questions.
Let me try and respond to that too. And I've been reading the chat, so I can't wait to get to some of these questions. And I know what we're here to talk about today, but I don't think we can have a comprehensive discussion without talking about all of the things that you just mentioned. There are a whole bunch of systems that are failing people every single day. And those system failures bring those people into our midst. And this is not me deflecting, it's not me making an excuse. You want a direct answer from me for something, ask a direct question. You might not like it, but I'm gonna answer it. And so how are we not talking about all of these things? I know that our focus is on what it is today, but I don't know that we can have a proper conversation without talking about all the other system failures, because here's the news. Law enforcement is the only entity that doesn't get to say, we're closed, call me back, make an appointment, right? We've conditioned our society, when you're in crisis, dial 911. You call, we come. And so I know this probably is not gonna go over well, but I'm saying it anyway. Here's the news. There are tens of millions of contacts with people in law enforcement every single year. Very few of those end in any force being used, let alone lethal force. Now, I don't say that to dismiss anybody who's lost a loved one at the hands of law enforcement. But I want us to be sensible, and I want us to be comprehensive about what we're talking about here, so that there's not this laser beam focus. I'm reading some of the comments about, you know, folks of color just being ruthlessly murdered every day by law enforcement. Now, folks, come on now. Let's be sensible about this, and let's keep things in their proper context, all right? So what about all these other systems that fail? What about those systems that get to just kick the can down the road? Now, if folks want to say, well, we're not here to talk about that today, okay, fine, then bring it on. I'll answer the questions that you have for me, but I don't want all of the good men and women who are out here serving and protecting every day to be painted with the same broad brush that, you know, the Derek Chauvins of the world, or the bad apples, or all the other horrible folks out here shouldn't be in our profession are being painted with. And I'll be quiet.
Let's go a layer deeper, because I think you're saying something that I think I think we could land a little bit of the plane with what you're alluding to. There's an issue that we clearly have in society where we have taken a lot of issues that are not police problems, right? You cannot arrest your way to a solution on mental health. You cannot arrest your way out to a solution on drug addiction. And we cannot arrest your way out of homelessness, right? All of those issues have been put on law enforcement to address. And I think that you child protection included, right? I mean, how many calls do departments get when parents have just had enough with their kids? I mean, I used to be a social worker, and we used to get those calls all the time, kids getting dropped off by the cops because they have, you know, issues at home that need to be mediated by counselors. We have put all of that responsibility on law enforcement. And I think, you know, I said we weren't going to debate defund the police, but I think one of the key components of defunding the police is looking at police budgets. Now, I know all of you represent departments that look at budgets like Minneapolis, and you're just like, yeah, that's not our reality. However, we do know that one of the reasons police budgets balloon is because we have asked you guys to solve a lot of problems that I'm just curious to the folks on this panel, do you believe that we should be asking police to solve all those problems? And let me be actually a little bit more clear. Does it make sense to the folks on this panel that the footprint of the profession of law enforcement probably needs to be shrunk? Speak freely.
Yeah, well, let me, Sheriff Stewart, you want to go, or you want me to take this one for a second? Let me take a quick run at it.
I just want to make sure we think bumper sticker and not disagree. All right.
Oh, come on now. No. So yeah, and I'm getting sad. I'm giving you the short version. Boy, that's really bad. Anyway, I'm sorry. But to your point, I agree with you. If someone else took over traffic enforcement, if somebody took over dealing with drug addiction issues, those type family intervention, I don't know that there's a lot of police officers that would say, "Oh, you're stealing my job." I haven't met a lot of men and women that entered law enforcement. They knew that was going to be a component of their job, but I don't know that they would be threatened if that was re-engineered and moved in a different direction. Herein lies the difficulty, I think, that over time as society, we're going to have to come to figure out what we're going to do. Are there a lot of social workers such as yourself that are community minded that want to work 24/7, 52 weeks a year? All right. And if we can't get that type of coverage from mental health, chemical dependency experts and others, then when they're off, who does that call go to? Is it going back to the police again? And if it is, did we accomplish really what we wanted to? So I think that becomes kind of the longer term issue. My experience with cops is they would be willing to offload that to experts and not be threatened by it. I don't know what the other panelists think, but we'll see.
Just quickly, if we can get to one more panelist response, and then I want to get to the questions in the chat.
I'd be happy to jump in. Yeah, I would agree with what Dr. Bostrom said, and that's part of the struggle we've seen. Conceptually, we know law enforcement wears 100 different hats during the course of any shift, and most of them they inherited due to other systematic breakdowns. And do they want to be there? Probably not, but they want to make a difference and they do want to help. So they respond to these things. We'll use mental health as an example. The concept of having mental health crisis response teams, I think everyone would agree in concept is a great idea. Let's get somebody the immediate help they need. But to Dr. Bostrom's point, not unlike any accident scene or any crisis call that we go on, paramedics, as an example, respond. They will wait down the street until they're told by law enforcement that it's a safe and secure environment. And I don't anticipate it being any different with a mental health worker going into a situation. If somebody's in a true crisis situation, I think most law enforcement would say that 98% of the time we're able to help people and we're able to get them in the right direction. It's those no situations, NO situations, where they don't care if you're a cop, a mental health worker, a pastor, or their father. It's going to be a bad situation because of either their extreme situation or drugs that are on board or coupled in combination. Those are the situations that we need to recognize that no matter who, however those dollars are rediverted or changed around, it's still going to have an impact on law enforcement, because most of those operations, if you can get those people that want to work 24/7, 365, they're still not going to want to go into those dangerous environments, which is where law enforcement unfortunately lives way too often.
Understood. So for the sake of time, I want to make sure we center the folks who joined us today. We have close to 50 people in attendance, and I've noticed lots of activity in the chat and the Q&A. Gina, are there questions that you've highlighted that you think that we have time to address?
Yeah, there are quite a few really good ones. And I think I know we're going to get to the legislative agenda that is going to talk a lot about policing and Representative Frazier's work. And so I think let's save that piece of it for then, because there's lots of questions around that, like traffic stops and all that.
Yeah.
And so I just want that whole thread in the chat, just to let people know we're going to get to that.
Maybe Dr. Cunningham, do you have a question from the chat that you want to highlight?
I actually have a couple of other ones.
Oh, okay.
So I just wanted to let people know, because there was a lot of talk in there that we're not avoiding it. So there was a couple around like cultural competence, and two of them were that kind of go together. Do language barriers impact your engagement efforts? And if so, do you have Somali officers or an interpreter available? And then do police departments use IDI, or how do they assess and grow for cultural competence? And I think that was for you, Chief Blair.
We have many ways that we develop and grow our officers, but to the first point, of course, language barriers they're what they are. They're barriers for all of us. How do we overcome that? We have several systems. Thank God for technology. We have what's called an ELSA system, right, which our officers take with them, and so it can interpret almost any language on the planet, so that we minimize that language barrier. But more importantly, we use a variety, and I'm gonna give them a plug. Martin McAllister does all of our development and assessment for folks who are going to be promoted or who are going to advance. The city of St. Cloud, we do insights, we do all kinds of things to measure and to gauge our level of inclusion and of competence and cultural awareness. And so I guess, and I'm glad somebody did ask the question, and I'll be quiet after this, because too often folks are not asking us what we are doing. They're simply telling us what we should do before they ask. And I think a lot of people would be pleasantly surprised at the things that are being done already in a proactive manner. that, and maybe that's our fault because we don't publicize it. We don't tell them what we're doing. We're busy doing what we're doing. And so these things do matter to us who are compassionate about what we do and who care about other people. And so that's my answer. Hopefully that answered your questions.
Thank you, Chief Anderson. Dr. Cunningham, do you have a question from the chat?
Yeah, I'm gonna do my very best. It's always challenging in these situations to answer everyone's question in the chat, but I'm gonna try to sort of summarize some of the things that I think were being asked. So one question I have is just, I think maybe the question is for anyone, but what does sort of advocacy work? And I really want to sort of ask specifically around issues of race. I mean, part of why we wrote a report with white supremacy in the title is because we think it's actually important to talk about, to use this language, even if it's something that perhaps as individuals we maybe have not experienced or not seen, but that we know exists. And so I'm just curious, it sounds like you all as individuals and as departments or programs are doing some really important or good work, or maybe you are not seeing these issues firsthand, but the data is absolutely there. The disparities are horrifying, and the disparities in the data represent human lives. And so I guess then I'm wondering is, if you all are doing kind of important work, or if you're seeing good work done in your smaller departments or communities, then what does advocacy work or look like? And do you feel like it's your place or position as members of law enforcement to actually engage in conversations around and racial disparity policing for
Dr. Cunningham, we lost kind of the last part of that, but do people understand the question? Do panelists understand the question? Okay. Chair McCarthy, you look like you're meaning for that mute button.
Yeah, I get really passionate about this. So, of course, I have a very pro-police bias. The most amazing human beings I've ever met are police officers, and I know our capacity to change and to adapt. And for too long, we as law enforcement leaders have failed our officers by not giving them the tools that they need to successfully deal with everybody in our community. And I believe this because if you talk to officers right now, what they're afraid of is being the next YouTube cop, the next police officer who their actions get interpreted some kind of way and that they think is unfair. And so it's really about changing the mental model of policing. And I'm working towards, I want every officer to be able to say that when policing is at our best, we fight for justice. Racism is an injustice. We fight against racism. And I want officers to be able to say that, and I want them to be able to mean it. And then I want to be able to give them the tools that citizens, we're not telling citizens that, but citizens start seeing that, because racism is in our DNA. It's in our DNA as a country. It's in our DNA as police. And we have to start confronting it and targeting it if we're ever going to move off from there. And so to give our officers the tools and the training, which is what we're trying to do with all sorts of things here. And the question was the IDI, and we're looking at, we just wrote a grant with Dakota County to get there. But officers are individual contributors. What they need to focus on is how are they as individuals treating individuals? And then law enforcement leadership, we need to make sure that we're changing the system to make sure that it's equitable, because an individual officer can't do that. It's a matter of officer safety. If we allow our racist thinking that Black bodies are more dangerous than white ones, which that's how I was taught, and certainly not explicitly, but it's in the reflection we see, that's an officer safety issue because we know that's not the case. We know Black men are not more dangerous. Yet if we focus on Black men, the real threat puts us at risk. It's just like we, are sexist when we think that men are more dangerous than women. And I think a lot of us learned the hard way that that's not the case. So, really getting into the nuts and bolts of it and being willing to take that action, that is how we support all those great cops. Because by letting the ones who are overtly racist remain in the profession, we're hurting the good ones. And until the public can see that across the board, I think we're failing everybody.
So I'm going to jump in here because this has sparked some thoughts that I think I shared with Dr. Bostrom this morning before the call when we checked in. Miriam Kaba, who is someone who is known to be an abolitionist and has written articles such as "So You Want to Be an Abolitionist," right? One of the things that she says in her New York Times piece, and I'm going to paraphrase here, I don't have the piece in front of me, is that there is not a moment throughout the history of America or the state of Minnesota where there has been a moment of racial tension or racial aggression or something that targeted the Black community with violence, where law enforcement wasn't center in that action. So we sit here today. I believe it was either yesterday or today is the anniversary of the lynching in Duluth. We sit here just a week or so past the anniversary of Black Wall Street down in Oklahoma. Minnesota has a history of sundown towns where if you were Black in certain areas of certain parts of the state and you were caught after sundown, you may never be found again. Minnesota is the home of the largest mass execution in the history of our country. With the Lakota people, recently, just last year, with what we experienced after the murder of George Floyd. What puzzles me, and what I'm asking, we have over 150 years of policing in this state. What puzzles me is that in other countries you have truth and reconciliation. And what I don't understand is that law enforcement as a profession has yet to stand up and recognize that history, right? And say that, Minnesota law enforcement has been part of the systemic oppression of particular groups of people, and has not stood up and said, we want to distance ourselves from those behaviors by adopting an anti-racist philosophy and becoming a champion for justice, as you referenced, Chair McCarthy. Why? why are we not seeing that kind of leadership from law enforcement? And does law enforcement have the courage? Because to Chief Blair's point earlier, every system has this. The difference is with law enforcement, often the failures or the racial inequities turn into blood in the streets and destruction of property. I think about the anniversary of Duluth, which was an opera crowd that lynched those three Black, Clayton, Jackson, and McGee. I mean, this is, and then we also know that the police chief today is the descendant of the woman who accused those men of falsely sexually assaulting her. Where is the reckoning? Where is the not us, we will net, where is the never again message that we've seen with other movements? Sheriff Stewart?
Yeah, just to touch on that, and I don't disagree that we're probably not vocal enough. You said, where's the message? Where's the message? And within my own office, we have what we call the vision talk. We have expectations. We talk about history. We talk about who we want to be as a culture, and most importantly, who we want to be for the community. And you're right, we probably don't wave that flag loud enough, perhaps, because I think it's common sense. Of course, we're going to stand against racism. And of course, we want equity and equality for everybody. And we're here to serve and protect everyone equally. And so, although we have those discussions amongst leadership and we have those expectations and vision with clarity for our staff internal, and occasionally from the looking outside the walls, like I said, we do the Facebook posts and we clearly stand against racism. But I'm not sure to what degree we bring that to the next level, right? I mean, other than opportunities like this, clearly we want to build bridges, we want to work with our communities, and we want to be part of that positive change for the future. But I also, there's a fine line, because we need to also not completely demoralize our current protectors who have done nothing wrong, who took this job because they're good-hearted individuals who want to serve the communities. And so when we start coming in and telling them, you know, you're bad people, or we need to fix you, even though they're like, you know, I've been here 3 years, I just want to serve and protect my community. There's that balance that we keep, you know, I keep using that word ambassador, because that's what we use as a culture. We need to figure out, and I love this dialogue, because that's what we need to figure out, is maybe there is the template, and how do we broadcast it more broadly? I'll tell you, I'll stand on the rooftops and say I absolutely, and my organization stands against racism, and we acknowledge the historical failures within our systems, and not just law enforcement. We talked earlier about the failures. How do we figure out to move forward is really the question, and we want to be part of that positive change to build those bridges.
So Sheriff Stewart, I'm glad you responded to this question, because and I think we need to pivot to talking about some of the policies at the Capitol. But so I started, just to share a quick, you know, personal story. So I started working on police accountability issues in 2006 when I joined the Civilian Review Authority in Minneapolis. And what I've learned from, you know, working on these issues since then is that it feels like every policy, every attempt that the community has to bring forth some sort of collaborative strategy where we say, you know, currently the dynamic at the Capitol is if, you know, or in the city of Minneapolis, you know, they just approved $5 million for police overtime, you know, and that doesn't sound like a defund movement to me, right? But if we were to ask for like some accountability measures along with those resources, right? Like the answer is no, right? And if we were to ask for, if you're going to put money into policing, but can you also put money into community violence prevention to support the neighbors, the pastors, the youth workers, frankly, the people that law enforcement relies upon when we know that the community won't talk to law enforcement, but people will talk to these other folks and can work together to find a solution? The answer is no. And so I'm curious, as we try to transition to some of the policy discussion now, it's a head scratcher. Like, we have these issues that we could be working together on, but when we look for law enforcement to be the biggest advocate for, you know, I would look for law enforcement to be the biggest advocate for issues that create racial disparities and inequities in our community. Law enforcement's nowhere to be found. And as a matter of fact, when law enforcement knows there's resources coming to them, and lawmakers and community members ask for investments in our communities, law enforcement's nowhere to be found in advocating for those strategies as well. And then when we know we have certain problems that produce racial disparities, and the community says, how about a little accountability, until there's a huge crisis like the murder of George Floyd. We got more police reform passed last summer than we had gotten passed in years. And so I would argue that this dynamic is what erodes trust, because if we were collaborating together, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is a real question, addressing the concerns in our community by making those type of investments and having some accountability that we all agree on, these things make the job of law enforcement much better, right? If you have it, I'll give one quick example, and then I'll let folks respond. In the city of Minneapolis, through the Police and Black Men Project, we worked with officers who were being called to do evictions. Well, evictions is a civil matter, not a criminal one. And so Charlie Adams went before city council and brought a proposal that said law enforcement shouldn't be doing evictions, and took officers out of doing evictions. And that kind of thing, to me, is an example of how law enforcement and community could be working together to shrink that footprint, so to speak. And I just don't feel like the community feels that. I don't feel like we see that enough. The same way law enforcement may not be seeing white supremacy amongst its midst, right? Reaction.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You weren't finished.
No,
sir.
I'm looking for reactions, Chief. Go
I'm
ahead.
going to try and address that, because you're talking about two different things. All right. First of all, you're talking about the will of a specific community. Yep, we have all, none of us thought we would have to be lobbyists at the state house to get permanent funding sources for things that we know work. So let me tell you a couple of stories. The other thing you're talking about is leadership, all right? And so let's not leave that off the table. And my colleague, whom I respect, Chief McCarthy, talked about that earlier in her comments, all right? So let me address the first one first. Yep, we have all gone to the State House and lobbied and begged and pleaded and asked for funding sources for things that we know work, only to be told, that's not important right now. That's not on the agenda right now. We're fighting it out. Democrats say it's daytime. Republicans say it's nighttime. I don't care what your politics are. It's frustrating as hell for all of us. So here's the story I'm going to tell you. When you talk about the will of the community, all right? Our community outpost in St. Cloud is not owned by the city. It's not owned by the police department. We deliberately put a 501c3 board in place before we dug one shovel of dirt out of the ground, because we didn't want it to become a political football, all right? And from that, I do know this: people support what they help create. And because it was marketed as a community project, we have gotten an outpouring of support from our community at every aspect, whether they are our corporate partners, our faith-based partners, our public entities. Everybody is invested in this, and that is the reason why it works. And that is the reason why Tom Emmer, whether you like him or not, you don't like his politics, he's put a bill forth on the House floor, the U.S. House of Representatives, to get the DOJ to appropriate money so there could be community outposts in every community in this country, because they work, period. I'm living proof of that. The other part you're talking about is a leadership issue. And so I unfortunately, we are a very metro-centric state. You know,
Chief, I know you
folks don't think anything else is happening outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And quite frankly, I'm tired of it, because there are a lot of good things happening outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So if everybody is pissed off at Minneapolis, great, but don't blame all of us for that. Ask us what we are doing first instead of telling us what we are not doing, because most times people don't know. Most people don't know that we have a co-responder model in St. Cloud. We have a mental health professional assigned to a patrol officer. And the only reason the patrol officer answered those calls is to do the threat assessment. And once that's done, we step out of the way and we let the mental health clinic handle that. And we do that in partnership with at least a half a dozen other entities. And so if I sound frustrated, I am a little bit, because folks need to know that there are things being done. We're not all just sitting here twiddling our thumbs and watching the world go by and watching, racism or white supremacy, whatever you want to call it, take over our discipline or our world. And so for me, and I'll be quiet, I guess I would like to be asked what I'm doing before being told what I should be doing, because sometimes I already have the answers to those questions. And that gets to the point of, how are we going to move forward? A lot of us have already started that vision and started going down that road of moving forward. So please, you guys, do us the courtesy of just asking, because we're here for you. We are here to serve you, and we do it selflessly. And we do it without whim or caprice. But before you pass judgment, I guess that's my ask. Just ask us what we're doing before you tell us what we're not and what we need to.
And I respect that, Chief. Like, this is the sort of the nature of this conversation, right? Is to have this conversation with law enforcement, to respond and talk about what is happening. Are there any other?
Yeah, Justin, I have a really, so Senator Jim Carlson is with us. And he had a great comment that I think is going to be a great kind of transition into our next section. I'm concerned that psychological evals are not done as a checkup from the neck up for officers that have had time in grade. My chief has had to have a psychological evaluation when he received a promotion. And then this is my question kind of to the panel. From a law enforcement lens, what are the policy, legislative, or boots on the ground changes that we can make, that the state can make to change the disparities we are seeing with traffic stops and searches and deaths and the stuff that we're seeing in our state? So from exactly what you were saying, Chief Blair, like what are some of the things that we could do to, that you guys maybe are doing or that we could do to make changes?
And I'll just say after this question, I'm just gonna present some slides about what's being debated at the Capitol, and we'll close things out.
You guys, I'm a practical guy from the Midwest, and I just think we need to be sensible. I'm looking at questions from people on the thing, and here's what it leads me to believe: that it doesn't matter what we say. Nobody wants to hear what we have to say about what we are doing, because here's a comment I just see on the chat. No, we don't need to ask first. You need to answer.
Did we lose Chief Anderson? So
goes up. If I can interject until he catches back up with us. I was thinking the same thing, and part of the struggle, this goes back, it keeps going back, bridge building, communication, how do we work together? And even in our own chat here, we see a lack of support, we see a lack of positivity. My attitude has been from the onset, how do we have positive interactions? And even, you know, whether it's inappropriate or not, I tell our team, even if you're on Facebook, I was talking about the Vision Talk earlier, if you're on Facebook, are you helping the situation or are you hurting the situation? Because something as simple as your comments, whether it's constructive or destructive, matters. And that's what we're trying to do I think we collectively, that's a part of this call. We need to figure out, how do we focus on the positive? How do we become supportive of each other to arrive at that middle ground and to build those bridges? Because again, including right in the commentary here, there's a lot of destructive, negative commentary being made. And to Chief Anderson's point, if we're not going to actually hear each other, then we're never going to build a bridge.
So Sheriff Anderson, Sheriff Stewart and Chief Anderson, first, I just want to say that given that it's 2021 and that half our state just burnt down because of outrage over what law enforcement has done, I definitely think the comments in the chat are more than appropriate. Considering that these conversations aren't happening very much because I think people are upset, people are angry, people are outraged. We, the community, if I may speak for the people that I have spoken with, not for everyone, want more from law enforcement. I love this comment in the chat from Cynthia that says, "I find it hard to believe what you say because I see what you do," by James Baldwin. And that is kind of to my broader point that I was speaking to earlier. It's 150 years worth of evidence. Law enforcement is locked up folks with a lot less. And we have one white man sitting in prison for the senseless murder of a Black man, when we know just from near, you can guess and be correct that there's been more murder of innocent Black men than what we've responded to. And so the tensions are high. I will just say, like, let's not criticize the comments in the chat is my point. I think people are being.
I understand that, and I understand the rage, and I've said to many people, had I been in Minneapolis on that day, I would have tackled Chauvin off the top of George Floyd. It was a completely inappropriate situation, and it shouldn't have happened. So don't misunderstand that. And I'm not trying to sound defensive, but I am passionate about a noble profession in which the vast majority of people are trying really hard to do the right thing. And that message is also being lost in the grand scheme. So I think we need to, again, just focus on, are we being constructive together? Are we being positive together? Because building walls isn't going to help any of us
And make no mistake, Mr. Terrell, I wasn't attacking anybody's comments. I'm addressing them. And so let's be careful how we characterize stuff. I'm not being defensive because I don't have to be, because if anybody asks me what I've done with my platform, what I've done as a law enforcement professional, I can answer you. And I can tell you, it will not be the same old deflections as I'm seeing, or it won't be the same old Pollyanna-ish or whatever. And so I'm sorry, but y'all don't get to tell me where I should or shouldn't be frustrated, because I know what I have done. I know what I've tried to do. And I know what the many men and women that I've worked with are doing on a daily basis. And so part of the problem is, there are folks out here that say they want to be inclusive and they want to hear what we have to say, but they don't believe us when we say it. And that's okay. Don't believe me then. Go out and find out for yourself, because you don't have to believe me. Go to St. Cloud and ask somebody at random, what is the St. Cloud Police Department doing? How are they addressing these issues? You don't have to believe me, but don't just reject it out of hand. And then don't tell me how I'm supposed to respond to it, because I'm a man of color. I've been Black my whole life. I'm one of 4 Black chiefs in this state. I get it, you guys. I understand what the outrage and all that is about, which is why I do things the way I've done before any of this madness. It's in a proactive mindset, and a mindset of not stripping human beings of their dignity. But okay, so let's help preserve everybody's dignity, not just the people that you want to advocate for, because I'm a human being too. And I ask no quarter. I'm simply saying that there are plenty of people in this profession who are doing it the right way for the right reasons.
So I just want to say, like, that the passion on this call is deeply appreciated, because we don't all agree. And I would argue that the comments on this call aren't putting up walls, that the walls have been there. And that the work of this conversation is to try to take a sledgehammer to those walls. And I don't think we're there yet, but I think that this conversation is helping to build that effort. I do want to present about the policies being debated at the Capitol. And I think that it kind of goes in line with this comment that I see in the chat. I've lost track of it, but it was basically asking, like, what is law enforcement doing to root out white supremacy, which I think is a really good question. And it seems that on this call that we're not even sure that there's wide agreement around throughout the profession what white supremacy is and how it shows up. But let's talk about efforts to address some of the concerns in law enforcement and where you all stand on that. So this presentation is, can you see my screen? All right. So this presentation is from the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage. And I'm just gonna go, there's a lot of policies being debated at the Capitol. And I'm just gonna cover just a few of them. So the first one is this human rights. So prioritize human rights in the definition of public safety used by law enforcement. This would change statute to include language similar to this. Second one is data collection, improved data collection about police misconduct. This is would be an expansion of an effort being kept at the post board. I'm sure Chair McCarthy can comment on that. Excessive force reports, so require officers to report when excessive force is used by the officers. Let me just pause here. Like, a lot of departments have their own databases and their own public, there are a few departments that have their own public dashboards where people can see local data, but we actually don't collect this data in a very strategic way at the state level. And so this would expand those efforts to be, that data to be collected at the post board. In qualified immunity, we spoke to this briefly. So this would end qualified immunity as a defense for police misconduct. Once again, this would extend the statute of limitations for lawsuits to be filed in civil cases against law enforcement officers. Civilian oversight councils, so allow local government units to create civilian oversight councils. This would also strengthen what those bodies look like and include things like subpoena power. So some additional reforms being debated are First Amendment assembly protections, which passed through the post board with unanimous support. So this would require the post board to develop a model policy on public gatherings. There's clearly support, as you spoke to this, I believe Sheriff Stewart, around having model policies is helpful. Ban white supremacist associations, so require the post board to prohibit peace officers from affiliating with or supporting white supremacist affiliation. So this would address the Land of 10,000 Cops Facebook page that was shut down. It would address the 3%er stickers on the patrol cars that Chief McCarthy has identified in the district close to where she's at. Equity and inclusion reforms, so ending pretextual traffic stops. So this would limit the authority of peace officers to stop or detain drivers based on equipment and other categories, tabs, for example. Sign and release warrants, require sign and release warrants for certain misdemeanor offenses. So once again, turning a traffic stop into a criminal investigation isn't always helpful. Just giving someone a reminder of their warrant and letting them go is an appropriate response in certain situations. And I should say that this bill actually is really clear about when sign and release warrants should be issued. So if someone's appeared in court for their initial sentence, initial hearing, or if they haven't been notified, for example, they would get a sign and release. They could get a sign and release from an officer. Eliminate no-knock warrants, which would regulate and establish reasonable limits on use of no-knock warrants and search warrants. Independent investigation. So this would create an independent body to investigate and prosecute officer-initiated use of force cases. Right now, we have the situation with Winston Smith, where the community is not getting very much information, and this would create a body that hopefully the community could put some faith in. The Attorney General authority, assign authority for prosecuting peace officers involved deaths to the Attorney General and provide the necessary funding for carrying out this charge. So once again, it all depends on who your Attorney General is. I believe people have opinions about that. Body cam footage would be required, the release of body cam footage within 48 hours of deadly force incidents. Once again, that's relevant. It's always one of the first demands that people have after critical incidents to release the tapes. Minnesota Heals Initiative would provide funding for Minnesota Heals Initiative grants to support families after officer-involved death incidents. This would come, I think, from the Office of Justice Programs, and then 911 operators. So this bill would require that 911 operators refer calls involving mental health crisis to mental health crisis teams when appropriate. So it would give 911 operators the option of how they respond to mental health crisis and not just sending officers. Let me see. I'll stop sharing my screen. I kind of ran through that fast, and there's plenty more policies being debated. And there's some that have passed this year and that have had support from law enforcement as well. Just what I shared these slides with all of you ahead of time. It was late, it was yesterday, but I just want to get your response to the policies that I just kind of ran through. I'm not looking for a yay or nay on each one, but what do you see as good ideas? What do you see as problematic? Where do we have work to do? And I think it's appropriate to start with Sheriff Stewart, since I've seen you testify on these issues before.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of different things that are listed there, and certainly going one by one, we'd be here till late night if we all had some opinions. But I think the short version is we need to be mindful that we've had some successes in the past couple of years. There have been some good things. And what you're seeing is, I think, again, a part of that accountability and that partnership. And I'll go back to that arbitration process. We wanted to see a different arbitration system because we were seeing officers being disciplined or terminated by their sheriffs and police chiefs who were given their jobs back. And with this new system, we're hoping that that's going to allow us to better hold bad cops accountable so that the rest of the law enforcement officers don't continue to have to work with bad cops and don't continue to have them reflect on our image.
Sheriff Stewart, I'm not sure that everybody on this call knows what arbitration is. Can you give just a real brief explanation of what that is?
Yeah, so the nickel tour is if we see a behavior we don't like, we think it's inappropriate, it does not meet our standards, it's unethical, whatever that might look like, the sheriff or police chief might move to terminate that employee. A union employee would then likely contact their representatives and go through a mediation process to try and negotiate for a lesser penalty. And when those mediation negotiations might fail, it'll go to a state arbitrator. Well, historically, the state arbitrators have been a panel of individuals in which I think there's 5 that are offered up by the state, and each side, meaning the union and or then administration, are allowed to strike away the arbitrators that they might not want representing them. So what happens is the ones who are selected and getting paid are the ones who have a record of the term I've heard used by some folks is splitting the baby. This time the union wins, next time the county wins, next time the union wins, next time the city wins, in order to make sure that they have that perception of being unbiased. Well, what happens when that occurs, we're not doing the right thing. We're just safeguarding the future of that arbitrator's job. And so police chiefs and sheriffs argued that we want to hold our staff accountable. We need to do that in order to safeguard the trust of our citizens. And so we pushed for and lobbied and were successful in getting the arbitration systems changed. So now there is a completely isolated law enforcement arbitration system that allows us to hold individuals to a higher standard, and in which the arbitrators are assigned by the state. So there is no more striking of individuals. It gives the arbitrators more opportunity to do the right thing. And I know that was a long tangent to arrive at one of the things that are going right, but I do think it's a step in the right direction. And you'll continue to see the law enforcement organizations continue to want to pursue that accountability, because we know there's nothing more important than the public trust.
So any other reactions, any other policies that folks would like to speak to? Dr. Bostrom, you've been quiet for a minute, and so I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I have some thoughts, but I think it's probably more helpful for the group to hear from Chief McCarthy, on this. I think the post board, sorry to put you on the spot, Chief, but I know you guys have been working on some of these issues before, and I think some of these policies are probably emanating out of discussions in the post board. And I think as the sheriff just described, some of the issues associated with labor management issues, I think there's some policy and some vision types of things that the post board has that could be really helpful for the group. But anyway, hopefully I didn't put you too much on the spot, but I think it'd be helpful to hear from you.
Of course, sir. No. Data collection, in my opinion, has been lacking. And so if we can get quality data, we could better guide training, resources, and public discourse. So for instance, when you look at anecdotally, if you asked me, do police officers need more de-escalation training? I would say absolutely. But then when I look at our mental health calls for service in which we have placed a transport hold on somebody involuntarily, meaning they didn't want to go. And then I look at how rarely we use force in those instances. It makes me think, okay, maybe my training dollars that I was going to use for de-escalation, I could use for something else. But without the data, it's really hard to make those informed decisions. When you look at officer discipline, the data helps with that. And it helps the officer too, because we can serve as an early warning system. So the devil is, of course, always in the details, and who gets the data and how it's used. But we have a long way to go, so that we're not just, we know what we know anecdotally, but the data really helps us show what is actually going on, and then how we need to reframe what we're doing. And no, I just saw the question pop up. De-escalation does not only hold for mental health crises. However, there is some de-escalation training that's geared specifically towards mental health. And so that's just an example. But data, I think we demand it in so many areas of our public, and taxes and roadways, and yet we don't really hammer on it when it comes to law enforcement. So the data is very important. And then in my personal opinion, this is not a post board opinion, allowing cities to have robust citizen oversight, meaningful citizen oversight, is what people in some communities have been asking for since the Kerner report in 1968. If you go back to that LBJ funded report, you have communities of color, predominantly Black communities, saying we want cops to be kind. We want cops to treat us the same way that they treat the white community. And we want citizen oversight. We want to know what's actually going on and what happens when we complain. And I think that robust, real citizen oversight will move the ball forward for our profession more than just about anything we're talking about here, in my opinion.
Thank you, Chief McCarthy. Any other comments before we wrap up? Katie, Gina, is there anything burning? I see a lot happening in the chat. I can't keep up with it as I'm listening to our panelists. But if there's one last thing we want to catch from there, here's our chance.
The one question that came up a couple times is that a couple people brought up, and I bring it up for your wife, is about youth and schools, and what are the panelists' thoughts about school resource officers in the schools and the disparities there.
Any takers?
I'll bite. Like anything, it's how it's applied. And within our schools, we have school resource officers, and it's a great way to build relationships. It's been very constructive. It's been very positive. And I think, and I'm going to digress a little bit here, but I think it's also important. I think as we look at some of the challenges in diversifying our organizations, it's also a way to humanize our law enforcement officers and hopefully establish some aspirations for future candidates. And that's one of the biggest things we need, is to help have the community's partnership in closing those gaps so that we can pursue more diverse organizations in the future. As I talked to our students around some of our schools, I said, there's problems. It's never going to be a perfect, but we're trying to make it a better system. But whatever you see as broken, I invite you to come join me in fixing it. Please come join our office. Be a part of the change. And so the school resource officers, I think, are a key part of helping do the right thing. My opinion.
Okay. Thank you, Sheriff Stewart. Thank you, Chair McCarthy. Thank you, Chief Anderson, Dr. Bostrom, Katie, Gina. Thank you so much. I'm going to close this out here and just say that this conversation was never going to be easy for me to facilitate. I will just share that transparently. But I'm so thankful that we all took a risk and had this conversation today. Katie, is there a way that we can save what's in the chat, right?
You bet.
Okay. So we will save the chat and share that with the panelists. I know that there are some folks we know in the chat that's going to be easier for us to respond to, but I think we should have emails from everyone so we can send an email update. Anything that we can find a way to address that wasn't talked about, because clearly there's a conversation that needs to be had. Our founder, Tom Johnson, who was a longtime advocate for reforms to the criminal legal system, he is the one who came up for our organization, came up with this frame that we are trying to use around identifying shared values, put the data behind those shared values, and produce the research, education, and policy development to advance those shared values. And over the last few months, we've been in community, listening to community on these topics. And the one thing that I come back to over and over again is that everyone wants to feel safe. Everyone wants to feel safe in their home, in their communities. And when you ask people what that looks like, people identify family, people identify safe spaces. In my home, we identify waffles because the safest time for us is when we're having waffles on Saturday mornings as a family and enjoying each other's company. Our law enforcement, the professional law enforcement is here to protect those things. And so with the wisdom of my grandmother, we got to keep the main thing the main thing. And wherever law enforcement misses the mark or lacks understanding or is doing well and is being responsive, like we need to seize those opportunities to build the system that we need for our community that serves us all, that protects our safety. And I think this conversation helps us move a little bit further down that lane. And we have a lot of work to do. This is quite the learning experience for me. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. And I look forward to continuing the struggle with you. The struggle continues. And with that, I will just welcome you to your weekend. Enjoy the rest of your day. Don't forget about Juneteenth next Saturday. So
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.